Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My name is Dr. Ayaz Afsar, and our topic today is narrative research design. What is narrative research? Well, the term narrative comes from the verb to narrate, or to tell as story in detail. In narrative research designs, researchers describe the lives of individuals, collect and tell stories about people's lives, and write narratives of individual experiences. As a distinct form of qualitative research, a narrative typically focuses on studying a single person, gathering data through the collection of stories, reporting individual experiences, and discussing the meaning of those experiences for the individual. With recent popularity, national research conferences have devoted sessions and papers to it, and educational journals have published stories reported by teachers, students, and other educators. New books are now available from publishers that provide essential information about the process of conducting this form of qualitative inquiry. So when do you use narrative research? We use narrative research when we have individuals willing to tell their stories and we want to report their stories. For educators looking for personal experiences in actual school settings, narrative research offers practical, specific insights. By conducting narrative studies, researchers establish a close bond with the participants. This may help reduce a commonly held perception by practitioners in the field that research is distinct from practice and has little direct application. Additionally, for participants in a study, sharing their stories may make them feel that their stories are important and that they are heard. When they tell a story, it helps them understand topics that they need to process. Telling stories is a natural part of life, and individuals all have stories about their experiences to tell others. In this way, narrative research captures an everyday, normal form of data that is familiar to individuals. We use narrative research when the stories told to us follow a chronology of events. Narrative research is a literary form of qualitative research with strong ties to literature, and it provides a qualitative approach in which you can write in a persuasive literary form. It focuses on the micro-analytic picture, individual stories, rather than the broader picture of cultural norms, as in ethnography, or abstract theories, as in grounded theory research. As an example of this micro picture, consider the case of Ms. Maya, who had two children in her 5th and 6th grade class, write stories about their personal lives. Anthony, a 9-year-old who considered himself an inventor and writer, kept a scientific journal of his discoveries and wrote an expressive piece about his grandmother. Anita, an 11-year-old, wrote about the good time she had in a swimming pool, learning to play kickball and being able to succeed at something. How did narrative research develop? Well, despite substantial interest in narrative research, its methods are still developing, and it is infrequently discussed in the literature. This has led to little agreement about its form. The narrative turn, as Reisman call it, embraces all of the human sciences, so that this form of research is not the providence of any specific field of study. Writers in literature, history, anthropology, sociology, sociolinguistics, and education all lay claim to narrative and have developed discipline-specific procedures. Like the art and science of portraiture discussed recently in the social sciences, this design involves drawing portraits of individuals and documenting their voices and their visions within a social and cultural context. So how did narrative research develop? However, a comprehensive overview of this design of research in education emerged in 1990. Educators such as D. Jean Glendinning and Michael Connelly provided the first overview of narrative research for the field of education. In their informative classic article, Stories of Experience and Narrative Inquiry, published in the Educational Researcher, they cited many social science applications of narrative, elaborated on the process of collecting narrative field notes, and discussed the writing and structure of a narrative study. This article expanded their earlier discussion about narrative within the context of teaching and learning in classrooms. More recently, these two authors expounded their ideas in a book titled Narrative Inquiry, which openly espoused what narrative researchers do. Within the field of education, several trends influenced the development of narrative research. Qualitative, for example, 1993, suggested three factors. First, there is currently an increased emphasis on teacher reflection. Second, more emphasis is being placed on teachers' knowledge, what they know, how they think, how they develop professionally, and how they make decisions in the classroom. Third, educators seek to bring teachers' voices to the forefront by empowering teachers to talk about their experiences. For example, Our Own Stories, reported by Maya, 1996, is a collection of stories about teachers sharing their experiences, whether they are sitting in the teacher's lounge at noon or after school. McEwan and Egan, 1995, provided collections of stories about educators as teachers and curriculum developers. For women in general, as well as for female teachers, their stories to children, to adolescent girls, and to their own female associates often take on a feminine repertoire to serve their female audiences. Hearing these stories has encouraged educational studies using the narrative approach. In fact, within education, a special interest group in AERA has been formed to create an ongoing discussion about narrative research. A growing number of interdisciplinary social scientists outside education have offered procedural guidance for narrative reports as a form of qualitative research. Interdisciplinary efforts at narrative research have also been encouraged by the Narrative Study of Lives annual series that began in 1993. What are the types of narrative designs? Narrative research assumes multiple forms. If you plan to conduct a narrative study, you need to consider what type of narrative study to conduct. Narrative research is an overarching category for a variety of research practices. For individuals planning a narrative study, each type of narrative provides a structure for conducting the study and ready references for how to conduct the project that faculty, journal reviewers, and book publishers will recognize. For those reading narrative studies, it is less important to know what type of narrative is being used and more important to recognize the essential characteristics of the type. The 5 questions discussed in the following subsections are helpful in determining your type of narrative study. Number 1, who writes or records the story? Determining who will write and record the individual story is a basic distinction in narrative research. A biography is a form of narrative study in which the researcher writes and records the experiences of another person's life. Typically, researchers construct biographies from records and archives, although researchers sometimes use other sources of information such as interviews and photographs. In an autobiography, the individual who is the subject of the study writes the account. Although not a popular approach, you can find reports of autobiographical accounts of teachers as professionals. How much of a life is recorded and presented? This question introduces a second distinction among narrative studies. In anthropology, numerous examples exist of stories of an individual's entire life. A life history is a narrative story of the entire life experiences of a person. Anthropologists, for example, engage in life history research to learn about an individual's life within the context of a culture sharing group. Often the focus includes turning points or significant events in the life of an individual. However, in education, narrative studies typically do not involve the account of an entire life, but instead focus on an episode or single event in the individual's life. A personal experience story is a narrative study of an individual's personal experience found in single or multiple episodes, private situations, or communal folklore. Broaden the personal experience story to be both personal and social, and convey these tones as the essence of the experiences reported about teachers and teaching in schools. So who provides the story? A third approach for identifying the type of narrative is to examine closely who provides the story. This factor is especially relevant in education, where types of educators or learners have been the focus of many narrative studies. For example, teachers' stories are personal accounts by teachers of their own personal classroom experiences. As a popular form of narration in education, researchers report teachers' stories to capture the lives of teachers as professionals and to examine learning in classrooms. Other narrative studies focus on students in the classroom. In children's stories, narrative researchers ask the children in classrooms to present orally or in writing their own stories about their learning experiences. Is a theoretical lens being used in narrative research? That is another question that shapes the character of a narrative. A narrative is whether and to what extent the researcher uses a theoretical lens in developing the narrative. A theoretical lens in narrative research is a guiding perspective or ideology that provides structure for advocating for groups or individuals in the written report. This lens may be to advocate for Latin American using testimonies, reporting the stories of women using a feminist lens in a personal narrative groups of 1989, or collecting the stories of marginalized individuals. In all of these examples, the narrative researchers provide a voice for seldom heard individuals in educational research. Can narrative forms be combined? In a narrative, it is possible to have the different elements listed above combined in the study. For example, a narrative study may be biographical because researchers write and report it about a participant in a study. This same study may focus on a personal study of a teacher. It may also address an event in the life of a teacher, such as a dismissal from a school, resulting in a partial life story or a personal narrative. In addition, if this individual is a woman, a researcher might use a theoretical lens to examine power and control issues in the school. This could lead to a feminist narrative. The final resulting narrative thus could be a combination of different elements: a biography, a personal story, a teacher's story, and a feminist perspective. What are the key characteristics of a narrative design, narrative designs? Despite the many forms of narrative inquiry, they share several common characteristics. Before reviewing the key characteristics, I will discuss them in general terms and relate them to the qualitative characteristics of research. Narrative researchers explore an educational research problem by understanding the experiences of an individual. As in most qualitative research, the literature review plays a minor role, especially in directing the research questions, and the inquirer emphasizes the importance of learning from participants in a setting. This learning occurs through stories told by individuals such as teachers or students. The stories constitute the data, and the researcher typically gathers it through interviews or informal conversations. These stories, called field texts, provide the raw data for researchers to analyze as they retell the story based on narrative elements such as the problem, characters, setting, actions, and resolution. Research process qualitative characteristics and narrative research characteristics. In research process, you have to identify a research problem. In qualitative characteristics, a qualitative problem requires exploration and understanding. And narrative research characteristics would be it seeks to understand and represent experiences through the stories individuals live and tell. Review of the literature. The qualitative literature plays a minor role. The qualitative literature justifies the research problem. And the narrative characteristics would be it seeks to minimize the use of literature, and it focuses on the experience of the individuals. The research problem would be develop a purpose statement and research questions, and what form they will take in qualitative characteristics. The qualitative purpose statement and research questions are broad and general. The qualitative purpose statement and research questions seek participants' experiences, whereas a narrative research characteristics is that it seeks to explore the meaning of the individual experiences as told through a story or different stories. The research problem or a process would be collect qualitative data, and in qualitative characteristics, qualitative data collection is based on using protocols developed during the study. Qualitative data collection involves gathering text or image data, and qualitative data collection involves studying a small number of individuals or sites. And in a narrative research characteristic seeks to collect field notes that document the individual story in his or her own words. How it is, what are the features or characteristics of narrative then? Its purpose of analyzing and interpreting qualitative data. How is it is done? Narrative characteristics seeks to analyze the stories by retelling the individual story. It seeks to analyze the stories by identifying themes or categorizing of information. It seeks to situate the story within its place or setting, and it seeks to analyze the story for chronological information about the individual's past, present, and future. And finally, the research process involves write and evaluate a study, and in qualitative type of study, qualitative research reports use flexible and emerging structures and evaluation criteria. Qualitative research, researchers take a reflexive and biased approach, whereas in narrative design characteristics seeks to collaborate with participants when writing the research study. It seeks to write the study in a flexible storytelling mode. It seeks to evaluate the study based on the depth, accuracy, persuasiveness, and realism of the account. So in this process, researchers narrate the story and often identify themes or categories that emerge. There's the qualitative data analysis. The qualitative data analysis may be both a description of the story and themes that emerge from the story. In addition, the researcher often writes into the reconstituted story a chronology of events describing the individual's past, present, and future experiences lodged within specific settings or contexts. Through this process of collecting and analyzing data, the researcher collaborates with the participant by checking the story and negotiating the meaning of the database. In addition, the researcher may interweave his or her personal story into the final report. So this brief overview of the process highlights specific characteristics of research often found in narrative reports. 7 major characteristics are central to any narrative research, and they are individual experiences, chronology of the experiences, collecting individual stories, restoring, coding for themes, context or setting, and collaborating with participants. So major characteristics of narrative design could be experience of an individual, that could be social and personal interactions. Chronology of experience, past, present and future. And life stories, first person, oral accounts of actions obtained through field text. Restoring or retelling or developing a meta story from the field text. Coding the field text for themes or categories, and incorporating the context or place into the story or themes, and collaboration between the researcher and the participants in the study, such as negotiating field text. What are the individual experiences? In narrative research, the inquirer often studies a single individual. Narrative researchers focus on the experiences of one or more individuals, although less frequent, researchers may study more than one individual. In addition to the study of an individual, the researcher is most interested in exploring the experiences of that individual. For Clendenin and Connolly 2000, these experiences in narrative are both personal. What the individual experiences, and social, the individual interacting with others. This focus on experience draws on the philosophical thoughts of John Dewey, who saw that individual experience was a central lens for understanding a person. One aspect of Dewey's thinking was to view experience as continuous, where one experience led to another experience. Thus, narrative researchers focus on understanding individual history or past experiences and how it contributes to present and future experiences. Chronology of the experiences. Understanding the individual's past as well as the present and future is another key element in narrative research. Narrative researchers analyze and report a chronology of an individual's experiences. When researchers focus on understanding these experiences, they elicit information about a participant's past, present, and future. Chronology in narrative designs means that the researcher analyzes and writes about an individual life using a time sequence or chronology of events. Cortese, 1993, suggested that the chronology of narrative research emphasizes a sequence. Cortese suggested that the chronology of narrative research emphasizes a sequence which sets narrative apart from other genres of research. For example, in a study about a teacher's use of computer technology in a high school classroom, the inquirer would include information about the teacher's introduction to computers, current computer use, and future goals and aspirations. The story reported by the researcher would include a discussion about the sequence of events for this teacher. Collecting individual stories. To develop this chronological perspective of individual experiences, the narrative researcher asked the participants to tell a story about his or her experiences. Narrative researchers place emphasis on collecting the stories told to them by individuals or gathered from a wide variety of field texts. These accounts might arise during informal group conversations or from one-on-one interviews. A story in narrative research is a first person telling or retelling of an individual. Often these stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Similar to basic elements found in good novels, these aspects involve a predicament, conflict, or struggle, a protagonist or character, and a sequence with implied causality, a plot during which the predicament is resolved in some fashion. In a more general sense, the story might include the elements typically found in novels such as time, place, plot, and scene. For those relating to narrative from a literary perspective, the sequence might be the development of the plot as it unfolds, the emergence of a crisis or turning point, and the conclusion or denouement. Narrative researchers hope to capture this storyline as they listen to individuals tell their stories. Narrative researchers collect stories from several data sources. Field texts represent information from different sources collected by researchers in a narrative design. Up to this point, our examples have illustrated collecting stories by using discussions, conversations, or interviews between a researcher and one individual. However, the stories might be autobiographical, with the researcher reflecting on his or her own story and interweaving that story with those of others. Often the researcher's role in the inquiry process may be central, in which they find themselves in a nested set of stories, stories within stories or embedded stories. Journals are another form used for collecting stories, as are field notes written by either the researcher or the participant. Letters provide useful data. These letters may be written back and forth between participants, between research collaborators, or between the researchers and participants. Family stories, photographs, and memory boxes, collections of items that trigger our memories, are other forms used for collecting stories in narrative research. After individuals tell a story about their experiences, narrative researchers retell or restory or remap the story in their own words. They do this to provide order and sequence to a story that may have been told out of sequence. Restoring is the process in which the researcher gathers stories, analyzes them for key elements of the story, time, place, plot, and scene, and then rewrites the story to place it in a chronological sequence. When individuals tell a story, this sequence is often missing or not logically developed. By restoring, the researcher provides a chronological sequence and a causal link among ideas, there are several ways to restory the narrative. The researcher conducts the interview and transcribes the conversation from an audio tape. This transcription is shown in the first column as raw data, that is coming in the next slide. So it is based on a project reported in Creswell 2000. The table shows the process of restoring interview data for a high school student who is attempting to quit smoking. The process involves 3 stages. Stage number 1, the researcher conducts the interview and transcribes the conversation from an audio tape. The transcription is shown in the first column as raw data. Next stage, the narrative researcher transcribes the raw data by identifying the key elements of the story. This is shown in the second column. I'll explain in a minute. The key at the bottom of the table indicates the codes used by the researcher to identify the setting S, characters C, actions A, problem P, and resolution R in the student's transcript. Finally, the narrative researcher restories the student's account by organizing the key codes into a sequence. The sequence presented in this passage is setting, characters, actions, problem, and resolution. Although another narrative researcher might report these elements in another order, this restoring begins with the place, that is McDonald's, the characters, the student, and then the events, behavior such as shaky and hyper. The researcher reworks the transcription to identify the elements of the story and restories the elements into a logical sequence of activities. To clearly identify these elements, the researcher might organize them into a table. This table describes 5 elements used in restoring. The setting is the specific situation of the story, illustrated by such factors as time, locale, or year. The researcher may discuss characters in a story as archetypes or portray them through their personalities, behaviors, styles, or patterns. The actions are the movements of the individuals in the story, such as the specific thinking or behaving that occurs during the story. The problem represents the questions or concerns that arise during the story, or the phenomena that need to be described or examined. The resolution is the outcome of addressing the problem, the answer to a question, or the conclusion reached in the story. It may involve an explanation about what caused the character to change the story. So these are the 3 columns. In column number 1 is the transcription of audio tape, that is raw data. In the second column, that is the retranscription by the researcher. In the first, there is transcription of audio tape. Second is reconstruction by the researcher, and third, restory by the researcher. So let's look at the one. Well, I know it wasn't the first time, but I remember this one most vividly. About a year ago, I'd been trying to quit and I hadn't smoked for about, I'd say about a month or more, so that is actually recorded. And when it is transcribed by the researcher, it would look like this. About a year ago, and the symbol here in square bracket is used as, that is about the setting. So it is telling about the time. I, it is in square bracket is C, means it is a character, had been trying to quit, and I hadn't smoked for about, I just didn't want to do it anymore. So that is a problem written in the square bracket. Was this guy, another interaction of a character, that I liked an action. At McDonald's is a setting place, but he didn't like me. He liked my best friend, and that is a friend, another character introduced. I had noticed, I had nicotine fits. Nicotine fits an action a lot. You get shaky, that is an action. You get really high, that is an action. So the way the raw data is transformed and transcribed by using the symbols. And in the third column you will see that is also summarized and written in a, that is a re-story of the one. A year ago I worked at McDonald's and I didn't buy cigarettes for about a month. So how it is changed, that is in a conversational style, and in restoring the researcher is rewriting it, and that is why it is called restoring it, and using the key phrases or clauses, narrative clauses. I had nicotine fits, I got shaky, I got high, I got hyper, I started bouncing off the walk. So look, there are the three stages, what the point I want to make. That is the raw material in column number 1. In column number 2, it is transcribed by using the codes, and the codes used here are the setting for S for setting, and C for character, A for action, P for problem. And then in the third column there is a restoring or rewriting of what the person said. Elements. The elements of setting, characters, actions, problem and resolution illustrate only one example of the elements that narrative researchers look for as they restory an individual's experiences. They might also use the elements of the three-dimensional space narrative structure advanced by Clendenin and Connolly 2000. So the organization of the story, organizing the story elements into the problem solution narrative structure. So what are they? In the horizontal line you see the settings and characters, actions, problem and resolution. So setting will tell about the context, environment, conditions, place, time, locale, year and era. Characters would be individuals in the story described as archetypes, personalities, their behavior, style and patterns. And actions, movements of individuals through the story illustrating the character's thinking or behavior. And the problem, questions to be answered or phenomena to be described or explained. And the resolution, answer to questions and explanations about what caused the character to change. So these are the basic components of any story or a narrative. The three dimensions of interaction, continuity, and situation create a metaphorical inquiry space that defines the narrative study. As researchers construct their story, they would include information about the following. The information would be about three headings. You have interaction, continuity, and situation. Under interaction, you could be the personal interaction, social interaction, past interaction, that comes under continuity, past, present, and future, and in situation would be the place. So personal, look inward to internal conditions, feeling, hopes, aesthetic reactions, moral dispositions. Social could be look outward to existential conditions in the environment with other people and their intentions, purposes, assumptions, and points of view. And in the past, look backward to remembered stories and experiences from earlier times. And present would be look at current stories and experiences relating to actions of an event. And the future, look forward to implied and possible experiences and plot lines. And the place, situation, would be look at context, time, and place situated in a physical landscape or in a setting bounded by characters, intentions, purposes, and different points of view. So interaction, the personal interaction, is based on an individual's feelings, hopes, reactions, and dispositions, as well as the social interaction to include other people and their intentions, purposes, assumptions, and point of view. Continuity, a consideration of the past that is remembered, the present relating to experiences of an event, and the future looking forward to possible experiences. Situation, as I said, information about the context, time, and place within a physical setting, with boundaries and characters, intentions, purposes, and different points of view. Next is the coding of themes. As with all qualitative inquiry, the data can be segmented into themes. Narrative researchers may code the data of the stories into themes or categories. The identification of themes provides the complexity of a story and adds depth to the insight about understanding individual experiences. As with all qualitative research, the researcher identifies a small number of themes, such as 5 to 7. Researchers incorporate these themes into the passages about the individual story or include them as a separate section in a study. So narrative researchers typically present these themes after retelling the story. Context of setting. Narrative researchers describe in detail the setting or context in which the individual's experiences the central phenomena. In the restoring of the participant's story and the telling of the themes, the narrative researchers includes rich detail about the setting or context of the participants' experiences. The setting in narrative research may be friends, family, workplace, home, social organization, or school. The place where a story physically occurs. In some narrative studies, the restoried accounts of an educator may actually begin with a description of the setting or context before the narrative researcher conveys the events or actions of the story. In other cases, information about the setting is woven throughout the story. Next point in narrative research design is collaboration. So that collaborating with participants. Throughout the process of research, narrative researchers collaborate with the with the study individuals. Collaboration in narrative research means that the inquirer actively involves the participant in the inquiry as it unfolds. This collaboration may include many steps in the research process, from formulating the central phenomena to deciding which types of field text will yield helpful information to writing the final re-storied story of individual experiences. Collaboration involves negotiating relationships between the researcher and the participant to lessen the potential gap between the narrative told and the narrative reported. It may also include explaining the purpose of the inquiry to the participant, negotiating transitions from gathering data to writing the story, and arranging ways to intermingle with participants in a study. Collaboration often calls for a good working relationship between teachers and researchers, an idealized situation that takes time to develop as a mutually illuminating story between the researcher and the teacher. Well, there are certain potential ethical issues in gathering stories, and now I turn towards them. When gathering stories, narrative researchers need to be cautious about the stories by asking some of the fundamental questions, such as, is the story authentic? The participant may fake the data, providing a Pollyanna story or a story with a typical Hollywood ending where the good guy or girl always wins. This distortion of the data may occur in any research study, and it presents an issue for narrative researchers in particular because they rely heavily on self-reported information from participants. The collection of multiple field texts, the triangulation of data, and member checking can help ensure that good data are collected. Participants may not be able to tell the real story. This inability may arise when experiences are simply too horrific to report or too raw to recall. It may also occur when individuals fear sanctions against them if they report their story, such as in sexual harassment cases. The real story may also not emerge because individuals simply cannot recall it. The story is buried too deeply in the subconscious. It may also occur because individuals base their stories on events that happened years ago, leading to early memories that may distort events and provide inventions of past actions. Although distortion, fear of reprisal, and inability to tell may plague storytellers, narrative researchers remind us that stories are truths of our experiences, and that any story told has an element of truth in it. So there are different steps in conducting a narrative research, and that has been summarized over here. What are the steps? Step number 1, identify a phenomena to explore that addresses an educational problem. Step number 2, purposefully select an individual from whom you can learn about the phenomena. Step number 3, collect stories from that individual that reflect personal and social experiences, and it may have two forms. Have them tell their story or collect other field notes. It could be recorded in two ways. And step number 4, re-story or retell the individual story, and that could be in the form of build in past, present or future, build in place or setting, describe their story or analyze their story for them. And step number 5, collaboration with the participant storyteller in all phases of research. And step number 6, write a story about the participants' personal and social experiences. And step number 7, validate the accuracy of the report. So let's take these steps in conducting a narrative research. The use of arrows in the diagram here show the direction of steps is only a suggestion and is not prescriptive of a process that you may or you might use. So let's take them a bit more in detail. Step number 1, identify a phenomena to explore that addresses an educational problem. As with all research projects, the process begins by focusing on a research problem to study and identifying in qualitative research. A central phenomena to explore, although the phenomena of interest in narrative is the story. You need to identify an issue or concern. For example, the issue for Hubba in a narrative study of children in a classroom consisted of stories about the difficulties that she and her student teacher Xuan had meeting the diverse needs of students. This included children excluding other children, using hurtful words with each other, and persistently using anger and aggression to solve problems. When exploring issues such as these, you seek to understand the personal or social experiences of an individual or individuals in an educational setting. Step number 2, purposefully select an individual from whom you can learn about the phenomenon. You next find an individual or individuals who can provide an understanding of the phenomena. The participant may be someone who is typical or someone who is critical to study because he or she has experienced a specific issue or situation. Other options for sampling are also available, although many narrative studies examine only a single individual. You may study several individuals in a project, each with a different story that may conflict with or be supportive of each other. Step number 3, collect the story from the individual. Your intent is to collect field text that will provide the story of an individual's experiences. Perhaps the best way to gather the story is to have the individual tell about his or her experiences through personal conversations or interviews. You can gather other field text as well, such as these. Have the individual record his or her story in a journal or a diary. Observe the individual and record field notes. Collect letters sent by the individual. Assemble stories about the individual from family members. Gather documents such as memos or official correspondence about the individual. Obtain photographs, memory boxes, and other personal, family, social artifacts. Record the individual's experiences, dance, music, film, literature. And step number 4, re-story or retell the individual story. Next, review the data that contain the story and retell it. This process includes examining the raw data, identifying elements of a story in them, sequencing or organizing the story elements, and then presenting a retold story that conveys the individual's experiences. You use restoring because the listener and the reader will better understand the story told by the participant if you sequence it into a logical order. What elements do you identify in the raw data for your story? How do you arrange these elements in your story? Narrative researchers differ about the elements to select, although in general you might mention the narrative elements found in a literary analysis of a novel. For example, time, place, plot, and scene are major elements located in stories by researchers. Focusing on the plot, you might identify an abstract of the events or actions, orient the listener, convey the complicating action, evaluate its meaning, and resolve the action. Another inquirer might examine the story for setting, characters, actions, problems, and resolution. Although several analytic strategies exist for locating and sequencing a story, all procedures order the story for the reader and listener using literary elements. Step number 4 was collaborate with the participant or storyteller. This step is one that interacts with all the other steps in the process. You actively collaborate with the participant during the research process. This collaboration can assume several forms, such as negotiating entry to the site and the participant, working closely with the participant to obtain field text to capture the individual's experiences, and writing and telling the individual story in the researcher's words. And step number 6, write a story about the participant's experiences. This is the major step in the process of research, is for the author to write and present the story of the individual's experiences. Although there is no single way to write the narrative report, it is helpful to include several features of narrative. Your story certainly claims a central place in the narrative report. In addition, you might include an analysis to highlight specific themes that emerge during the story. Typically, you do not include a specific literature section. Instead, you incorporate the literature and research studies about the problem into the final sections of the study. Because readers are often not familiar with narrative, you might write a section about the importance of narrative research and the procedures involved in it, so that you can inform readers about narrative research. As with all qualitative research, you are present in the narrative report and you use the first person pronoun to refer to yourself. And step number 7, validate the accuracy of the report. You also need to validate the accuracy of your narrative account. When collaboration exists with participants, this validation may occur throughout the project. Several validation practices, such as member checking, triangulating among data sources, and searching for disconfirming evidence, are useful to determine the accuracy and credibility of a narrative account. So how do you evaluate a narrative research? As a form of qualitative research, narrative needs to be consistent with the criteria for a good qualitative study. In addition, there are specific narrative aspects that people reading and evaluating a study might consider. In a high quality narrative study, the researcher keeps the focus on a single individual or two, reports the life experiences of individuals as told through stories, and restories the individual stories and tells the story using a chronology with a beginning, middle, and end. Describes in some details the context of the story, that is the setting, the place where it occurs, the people involved, and so forth. Reports themes 5 to 7 to emerge out of the story. Closely collaborates with the participants providing the story and engages with the participant by having them check the evolving story frequently and examining the final story to see if it accurately reflects the individual's experiences. Well, that was all about the narrative design and narrative research design. I hope that you would have learned the basic principles of narrative research design, and you would, if you are interested, you would like to develop your own research plan on narrative design. Narrative as a method, narrative as an inquiry, and narrative as a kind of qualitative or a post-positivistic approach, and that is well established in educational research. It is multidisciplinary and it is gaining momentum. Well, thank you very much for listening. Until next lecture, goodbye.